August 15, 1945. The world's first peaceful morning in 6 years begins not with fanfare, but with the soft crackle of radios left on overnight and the rustle of newspapers landing on quiet doorsteps. Across New York, London, and Tokyo, headlines shout, "Japan surrenders." Yet behind the bold type, ordinary people wrestle with exhaustion, relief, and the staggering figure of 60 million lost. This day would be remembered as victory, but what did it really feel like to wake up in the fragile dawn after World War II's end? The answers are tangled in those uneasy hours before the world understood what peace actually meant. James Harvey balanced his bicycle against the curb on West 78th Street, hands raw from the morning's chill. The city still felt half asleep, the air heavy with the scent of wet pavement and yesterday's newsprint. He reached into his canvas bag, pulled out a thick bundle, and slid a folded paper beneath the door of the corner grocer. On the payroll ledger for August 15, 1945, his name appeared with a small asterisk, double shift, VJ Day. For James, the route was the same as any other morning, but the weight of the papers felt different. He knew what they carried. Across the Atlantic, Ellen Murray set a kettle on the stove in her narrow London kitchen. The blackout curtains, so familiar for so many years, hung limp at the window, no longer drawn tight. She stepped outside, slippers brushing the stone steps, and nodded to the boy leaving a stack of Daily Telegraphs at the bakery. The headlines would wait. For now, the city's first light was enough, silence not broken by sirens or distant guns, but by the clatter of milk bottles and the low hum of conversation starting to return. In Tokyo's Sumida ward, Kenji Saito rose before sunrise, the habit of early hours unbroken by the war's end. The press notes from the city's printing houses showed limited runs, paper shortages, and censorship, still dictated what could be printed and what could not. Kenji's morning began not with headlines, but with the measured steps of neighbors sweeping dust from their stoops, waiting for news that might finally explain the emperor's words from the day before. The city's printers had worked through the night, but the morning's editions held little beyond official statements and vague reports. It would be days before the full truth reached the hands of ordinary people. Between 4:30 and 6:30 a.m., the world's great cities stirred in small, familiar ways. Newspapers slid under doors. Bakers tallied the day's flour, and the first trains rattled through empty stations. The routines of peace moved quietly, almost cautiously, as if testing the boundaries of a new reality. The morning's news was still hidden in folded sheets and unread headlines, waiting for hands to open them and for voices to read them aloud. At precisely 7:00 p.m. Eastern Time on August 14, 1945, President Harry S. Truman stepped before the microphones in the White House, his voice steady and grave, carried across the country by radio. "This is the day we have been waiting for since Pearl Harbor," he began. In that moment, the official words swept through American towns and cities. Japan had accepted the terms of unconditional surrender. No more waiting, no more rumors. This was the confirmation millions had hoped to hear. Truman's statement was clear. The Japanese government has agreed to our terms fully. The war is over. In Tokyo, the world changed at noon on August 15. Emperor Hirohito's voice, unfamiliar to almost all his subjects, broke through the static on radios set atop kitchen tables and tatami mats. "We have resolved to pave the way for a grand peace for all the generations to come by enduring the unendurable and suffering what is insufferable," he intoned. His words reached into every home, signaling a surrender that few dared speak aloud. For many listeners, the meaning was veiled in formal language, but the message was unmistakable. The fighting would stop. It was the first time the emperor had ever addressed his people directly. Across Britain, the BBC's home service relayed the news at midnight. Prime Minister Clement Attlee's voice followed Truman's, confirming that Japan had laid down arms. BBC engineers logged the moment, 23:00 BST, August 14, as the bulletin went out to a nation weary from years of blackout and bombardment. Radios stayed on through the night, their dials glowing in the dark as families waited for every scrap of information. The BBC's relay of Hirohito's broadcast, received by shortwave and translated mid-morning, brought the Japanese emperor's words to British listeners for the first time. By dawn, the official declarations had circled the globe. In New York, London, and Tokyo, the words of presidents and emperors echoed in the quiet of kitchens and on street corners. The news was no longer rumor or hope. It was fact, spoken in voices that carried the weight of war and the promise of peace. These broadcasts set the tone for the morning's headlines, their phrases repeated in bold type and whispered over breakfast tables. The world's leaders had declared the war at an end. Now, it was up to ordinary people to absorb what that truly meant. Inside the composing room of the New York Times, the night of August 14 stretched on under fluorescent lights and the smell of hot lead. Leslie Slocum, the paper's chief night editor, stood at the proofing table, scanning a series of headlines that had already been set and scrapped, each one a relic of uncertainty from the hours before. By 2 a.m. Eastern Time, the presses waited for his final sign-off. The decision was not about what had happened, but how to say it, how to capture the end of a world war in a single line of type. The front page that rolled out before dawn bore a headline in black, towering letters: Japan surrenders. 96-point sans serif type, stretching the full width of the page. No exclamation mark, no embellishment. The words themselves, in their sheer size and weight, carried the authority of an official proclamation. This was not the language of celebration or spectacle. It was the language of finality, a headline meant to be read aloud in kitchens and on stoops, to be clipped and saved in family Bibles, to be believed. The layout below the fold was dense, columns packed with dispatches from Washington and Tokyo, a byline from Arthur Kroc, and the first lines of President Truman's statement. This is the day we have been waiting for since Pearl Harbor. A map of the Pacific, inked in grayscale, traced the arc of the war's last days, while subheadlines recounted the sequence of diplomatic cables and the terms of unconditional surrender. Nowhere on the page did the Times allow itself the wild typography or patriotic banners found in some rival papers. The editorial choice was deliberate. Slocum had argued for restraint, insisting that the moment demanded clarity, not spectacle. The presses ran through the night, paper rationing temporarily set aside for this edition. By sunrise, bundles of the Times waited on Manhattan street corners, their bold headline visible from half a block away. For many, the first sight of those words, Japan surrenders, delivered a sense of relief that was both overwhelming and strangely quiet. The war was over, not with a shout, but with a headline that filled the page and left room for the world to catch its breath. In London, the morning's news arrived with a sense of restraint sharpened by years of endurance. The Daily Mail's front page, printed in a careful 72-point Bell sketch type, read simply, "War ends." No banners, no exclamation marks, just a line of type that seemed to exhale. Below it, columns recounted the Prime Minister's midnight broadcast and the BBC's translation of the Emperor's words, but the editorial voice was measured. The Telegraph followed suit, its 48-point Garamond headline stretching across the page, "Japan surrenders." The language was formal, almost spare, as if the ink itself carried the weight of so many lost years. In these pages, celebration was muted, edged by remembrance. Casualty figures, 60 million, perhaps more, ran alongside reports of church bells ringing and the first public holidays in months. Across the channel, the story unfolded under different constraints. In Paris, Le Monde's early September edition reflected a city still shadowed by occupation and scarcity. The headline, set in modest type, announced peace, but warned of the hard work ahead. La paix, mais à quel prix? Electricity rationing shaped the layout. No sprawling banners, few photographs, columns compressed to save paper. Distribution itself was a challenge. With bombed rail lines and fuel shortages, many Parisians read the news days late, passed from hand to hand, or recited aloud in café. In Frankfurt, the first post-liberation issues of the Rune Schau featured headlines that were factual, almost clinical, capitulation Japan's. The type was small, the paper thin, the ink sometimes blurred by recycled newsprint. There were no extras, no special editions. Printing presses operated on borrowed time and borrowed power, with Allied authorities reviewing every line of copy. While American newspapers filled their pages with maps and dispatches, European editors rationed every inch. The difference in tone was clear. Relief, yes, but also exhaustion, discipline, and the memory of devastation still fresh in every city block. The morning's headlines did not shout. They spoke quietly, carrying the news of peace with the same gravity that had carried the news of war. In these pages, the end of conflict was not a spectacle, but a sober fact to be absorbed, one cautious line at a time. Kenji Saito paused at the threshold of his home, the first hint of sunlight tracing the edges of the sliding door. In Tokyo, the morning after the emperor's radio address was neither jubilant nor loud. The city's rhythm felt cautious. Neighbors swept their stoops in silence. Shopkeepers stared at empty shelves, and the usual clatter of delivery carts was subdued. For most, the news of surrender had arrived not in print, but in the unfamiliar trembling voice of Hirohito, broadcast at noon the previous day. The words were formal and indirect, urging endurance and peace, and left many listeners uncertain of what had truly been decided. On August 16th, the Asahi Shimbun's presses ran a limited batch, the headline set in dense, restrained kanji. A simple acknowledgement, shaped by the Ministry of Home Affairs' strict directives. The front page avoided the word defeat, offering only the official statement and fragments from the imperial broadcast. Details of the surrender, the terms, and the fate of the nation were absent. The censors, wary of panic or unrest, allowed no mention of occupation or the full scope of Japan's losses. Even the print run was modest, hampered by shortages of both paper and ink, with copies reaching only a fraction of the city's households by dawn. Kenji's neighbor, an elderly woman who had lost 2 sons in Manchuria, stepped into the street with a folded newspaper. She read the headline once, lips moving silently, then tucked it away. The paper offered no comfort, only the confirmation of what everyone already sensed. The fighting was finished, but the future was uncertain. Diaries from that day record a city holding its breath, people gathering in small groups to discuss the emperor's words, some misinterpreting the vague language as a call for continued sacrifice. The official narrative left little space for emotion. In the absence of clear answers, daily routines resumed with a kind of muted resignation. Children walked to fetch water, men queued for rice rations, and the radio, still considered a luxury, remained tuned to official bulletins. The sense of relief was real, but it was tempered by exhaustion and anxiety. For Kenji, the morning's paper was less a record of victory or defeat than a document of survival, shaped by forces beyond the reach of ordinary citizens. The city's first peaceful morning in years arrived quietly, its meaning concealed between the lines of a censored headline. Eleanor Roosevelt's words, published on August 15, 1945, reflected the weight that settled on millions that morning. In her syndicated column, she wrote, "We wake to peace, but our hearts are heavy with the price." The headlines had declared an end, but the numbers beneath those bold letters told a different story, one of loss stretching across continents. British newspapers listed the dead, 60 million, perhaps more. The Times printed a letter from a mother in Kent, her son's name lost among the missing, asking if peace could ever feel real with so many gone. Across Europe, columns detailed not only victory, but the scale of devastation. 12 million displaced, cities hollowed by years of war, families searching for each other among the ruins. In the United States, editorials balanced relief with a tally of sacrifice. The New York Times recounted the most destructive war in history. Reports estimated 50 to 60 million dead worldwide, though no one could yet grasp the full measure. The numbers were incomplete, the stories behind them impossible to print in a single edition. On kitchen tables and in church pews, readers lingered over casualty lists and maps of battlefields now silent. For every headline announcing peace, there were pages of names and places never to be whole again. As the world absorbed these figures, attention turned to the waters of Tokyo Bay. On September 2, 1945, the formal surrender ceremony unfolded aboard the USS Missouri. The ship's log marked the moment. At 9:02 a.m., Japanese Foreign Minister Mamoru Shigemitsu signed the Instrument of Surrender, followed by General Yoshijiro Umezu. General Douglas MacArthur, standing as Supreme Commander for the Allied Powers, accepted the documents at 9:26 a.m. The signatures of representatives from the United States, China, the United Kingdom, the Soviet Union, and other allied nations followed, sealing the end of the conflict in ink. MacArthur's words echoed across the deck. "We are gathered here, representatives of the major warring powers, to conclude a solemn agreement whereby peace may be restored." The ceremony was brief, lasting less than half an hour, but its consequences stretched far beyond the rails of the Missouri. For those who read about it the next morning, the ritual was both a relief and a reckoning. The legal end of the war brought no return to what had been lost. Instead, it offered a line in history, a point from which the world would have to begin again. The morning after the headlines, peace was a fact, but it was also a challenge. The numbers in the papers were not just statistics. They were the measure of what it would take to rebuild, and the reason so many found themselves silent, even as the world declared the war was over. Every headline that morning marked not just an end, but the start of a world forced to reckon with loss on a scale never seen, over 60 million dead. Today, peace remains fragile, shaped by choices made in those first uncertain hours. The challenge endures, to remember what was lost, and to protect what was so nearly destroyed. What would your first act be if the world reset tomorrow?